In this episode, we want to talk about Paul, the letter writer. And why is Paul, the letter writer, so important to our study of the Christians? First of all, the letters are the earliest documents that we have now in our time, derived from the first century of Christianity. These letters, 13 letters, written to various congregations in various cities, Corinth, Thebes, Galatians, etc. These letters talk about the conditions in those Christian communities, the issues that are important, the issues for Jews that are important. All the different issues are taken up in 13 letters spread between 50 AD and 65 AD. So there's 15 years when Paul writes 13 letters that survive and tell us all about the conditions in different Christian communities around the Eastern Mediterranean, all around the Eastern Mediterranean, all of Greece, all up and down the coast of present-day Turkey, and then including Jerusalem. So those are the letters. During this period now, so 40s, beginning in the 40s, but for sure in 50. That's the first written document to survive from the New Testament period. So in other words, we have letters from Paul before we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So that's very helpful for us identifying the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John dates, because it means he's going to say things in these letters that we know mean that already in 50 the preaching had been formed. And we could recount what it is, what the generally shared preaching was for everybody. And there were multiple men out preaching, of course. You know, John was preaching, and other members of the apostles were preaching. And so there were multiple people out traveling around and preaching. And what we know from the letters that he had written, they do help you be precise about, how much later could Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John be. It can't be too much later, because already in Paul's letters, he's saying what the preachers are saying when they get the opportunity to talk. Remember now, if they're doing a talk like here in Athens, they're talking to Greek philosophical students who've studied all the great Greek philosophers, all the people we know about, Aristotle, Plato, and everybody else, the scientists, all those scientific Greeks that we mentioned, all those people, Euclid, Ptolemy in Alexandria, all these studies would be in their mind as they listen to this man say what the universe is like and how it was formed and all the rest of it. They're just agog, God created the heavens and the earth. What? Hera and Juno and the rest of them are up in the heavens. What are you talking about? So he had to be extremely well versed in Greek philosophy. He has to know what he's talking about, because he's going to be arguing in public. You're going to have debates, and he's going to have to know what he's talking about. So he will have studied the Greek philosophy. He knows Greek, and he knows Latin. So he's a typical international East Mediterranean intellectual who's lived in Jerusalem, studied the Jewish tradition, knows Hebrew, of course. So he's at least trilingual. So he's writing the letters in the 50s, and then by 49, you have the first council of Christians anywhere. And that's all in Acts. We can go back to it later. So he's there, and others are there. James is there. Peter's there. All the names of the people you might know. They're there at the council. And they're all trying to decide how to go about the transformation of their group from all these Jews to non-Jews wanting to join the club. See, they've heard the preaching, and they're coming up to Paul or John and saying, well, how do I join the club? What are the rules? What are the requirements to get a membership? So they came up to Paul expecting there might be dues for joining Christianity. What are the dues? And of course, Peter, Paul, and the others explained that it wasn't so much the expense of it, but it did involve a little bit of discomfort. So, of course, when all these non-Jews found out the dues that were required to join their meeting and come into their club, there was consternation. If you're 30, and you'd like to join the Christians, you don't particularly want to be circumcised. So the council had to decide what they were going to do. They have to decide, and they discuss it. What are we going to do? What are we going to do about this particular issue for non-Jews who'd like to come in? So that's part of the council, and it gives you a date, 50. You see, so just about the time he's starting to write his letters, they have their first meeting, and it's all written down in Acts, so that means Luke was probably there, or Paul gave him careful resume. And then he's arrested in Jerusalem for, stirring up trouble, and any of the local authorities could have arrested him for stirring up trouble, but he hadn't been arrested by the Greeks or the Romans, and now he's arrested in Jerusalem. So he appeals to the emperor in Rome, and I think you had to pay your own passage if you made this. If you made this demand, you agreed to pay your passage. So they had to wait some time for the ship, and he would have probably been under house arrest. So that means they know where he is. He has to stay there. And then when the ship comes that's approved of and he can pay for, then he finally is taken to Rome, and he would be in Rome about 60. We know he's there several years, first of all waiting for justice, second of all, the sentence comes down, and it may have been late that he was sentenced to death. That may have been, say, 64 or something, or it could have been there was no decision, and then suddenly the decision came down. So he's in Rome, 64, 5, and Peter is there too, and Luke is there too. So we know at least those three, and it's probably true that Mark is there too, because Mark, once he writes his book, he knows everything from Peter. You can tell where he got whatever he has, whatever he knows. He wasn't in Jerusalem, didn't see the crucifixion, didn't know Jesus. He's writing it down from Peter. So it's called the Petrine source, Petrine, the Petrine source, meaning all got it from Peter. And so here he is in Rome, and we'll just remember from previous nights, we've talked about Rome. Why is Rome where it is? Well, of course, it's this great spot where you have hills to the west, hills to the north, hills to the east, then this big sort of bowl with the river Tiber running through it. Here's the Tiber running through it, and here's the little island that's in the middle of the river right there. There it is. And that is the way you cross the river. So just like Paris and lots of other cities, there's an island in the river, and that causes the creation of the city. Paris is identical. It's the exact same reason that Paris is where it is, and it's the exact same reason that Rome is where it is. Here's the little piazza you come into when you come off of the river, and here's the opening through here. So again, if we look through this piazza, there's the river right there with that little temple, and you come right through here, and then you can get through the two high hills, one the Capitoline Hill, and one the Palatine Hill. You can just pass right through this little valley, little low spot, and into the Forum. So it was predictable that the Forum would be the center of Rome. There's a picture of it, looking like right straight through. There's a little arch there, and you go through, and then you're in the Forum. So there's the Forum. And we remember all this from last week. Why Rome where it is, unique place on the river network, puts a connection to Greeks, puts a connection to the Etruscans, and puts a connection to the Carthaginians. All of those things feed into the richness of Rome. And then you have that little inner area, the Forum, which was a perfect center for the city. There's the blue marker on what we just talked about. So here's the island. Here's the section through, and there's the Forum, and you can always see where the Forum is because the Colosseum sits at the southeast end, and you can always see the Colosseum on a map or anything else. So there's the Forum, there's the Capitol Hill, and the other hills. So they took their trip to Rome, and of course they are in Rome at the moment that Nero is ruling Rome. So if you think about Peter and Paul in Rome and the year, they picked a very bad year to be in Rome. This was an unfortunate coincidence. If they'd come under Claudius, they might have had a nicer time of it. But Nero was not someone you would choose to be your emperor if you were going to be appealing to the emperor. Here's just the whole dynasty of Julius Caesar and his great-nephew
Octavian, who became Augustus. So there's Caesar up there. Here's his successor. That's a dotted line because he adopted him, but he really was his great-nephew. And then Augustus has a big family, but no sons, and no direct successors, right? No son from him and his wife, but he had stepsons from his wife Livia, and so that produced Tiberius. Tiberius will be Octavius' successor, a smart, brilliant man who rules to 37 A.D. Then, by the time he dies, his son, who could have been a great emperor and would have been his successor, was already gone. He had left a daughter, and that daughter had a connection to the other great-grandson, Nero. So by marrying Claudius's daughter Octavia, Nero has two connections to Tiberius and Augustus. So he becomes the emperor in 54 to 68. So it's short, 14-year reign in the middle, and exactly at the time that both Peter and Paul and Mark, most likely all three of them, and Luke. So it's very likely it's Peter, Paul, Mark, and Luke. So that would be two writers of the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John foursome that were in Rome, would know something about Rome, would know something about the persecutions, and would also know about the executions of Peter and Paul. So here's Nero. Nero had been, endowed with the greatest of families, had come from the greatest of grandparents and great-grandparents, and so theoretically, as a young man, he would have been a welcome emperor, and he was. When he first came on the throne, everybody in Rome was delighted. He was young, he was still a teenager, single teenager with his mother close to him, Agrippina. So in the beginning, he had what are now referred to as 5 good years. Now that's a clear signal to you about what the rest of it was like, because if you remember Nero for having had 5 good years, well then do the math. That left quite a number, another decade, that weren't going to be so good, and they were pretty terrible. Nero just turned into a kind of drunken sex fiend. That sounds like a pretty good summary right there. A drunken sex fiend who would stage these massive several-day banquets where hundreds of people would come and go and eat and drink and get drunk and fall down into the pools and be laying around in the corners having sex. And so fairly quickly, the Neronian court was known all over the world as corrupt. And then, in 64, the Great Fire of Rome. Terrible, terrible fire, worst fire ever in Roman history, where it seemed almost to have been set because multiple fires blew up at the same time in different locations. And so very quickly, word started spreading that Nero had done it intentionally. Why would you burn up your own city? Well, because everybody knew, and when the fire was over, it came true, that he had an idea that he wanted to build the greatest palace anybody had ever had, and he wanted to build it right where the Colosseum is now, right north of the Colosseum, and he needed space. So people started accusing him of intentionally burning up Rome so he could build his own golden palace. You can visit the Golden Palace to this day. It ended up getting buried. Later, people hated him so much they just plowed it over with dirt. But then the archaeologists have found it again. So you can go and see the Golden Palace of Nero right north of the Colosseum, right across the street from the Colosseum. And then they take you down inside what is the surviving rooms of the Golden Palace. Some of the rooms are just phenomenally huge with paintings and all kinds of stuff. So the fire then was a terrible, terrible thing, and Rome was turning against him, so he blamed the Christians. He just said they did it. They burned up Rome. Nobody knew why. Nobody could say why. There really wasn't any reason that they would have done it, but it didn't matter. He had a reason, and so now he could persecute the Christians, which he did. So this is the first big imperial persecution, mostly in Rome, where the emperor is going to arrest hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Christians and literally feed them to the lions. I mean, you've heard that. You've heard them talk about feeding the Christians to the lions. Well, that wasn't a joke. I mean, they really did feed them to the lions. And so here is a stadium, and these are actual Christians. If you wondered what these burning torches are, those are Christians. Yeah, they're providing the illumination. They're soaked with oil, and then he has them lit up so they can provide light. And here are the Christians all waiting there for the lions to chew them up, which is what happened. So this is the first great, huge persecution of the Christians that we know about, any place in the empire. This is the first one. Even in the Greek city-states where Paul and others would come and preach, there really wasn't much violence. It was linguistic violence. They would attack them, but nobody was arresting them and killing them. Not yet. That's 64, 65. And so we're all guessing in our guessing of the dates of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John that it's right after that, because now they're suddenly aware that these witnesses of what happened in Jerusalem are now being killed, so they'd better write it down while they remember it. So we can guess that maybe Mark sat and wrote his book right after the execution of Peter. Here's some other evidence about the Christians. We have 3 major sources, non-Christian sources from the first century. So there's 3 other important people who wrote about them. Most important is Tacitus, greatest Roman historian of all time. He produced the Annals, and he's writing towards the end of the century, but he's covering the whole history, and he refers to Christ and to the execution and to Pontius Pilate and the existence of these Christians in Rome in his Annals. For all of you who are very, very fluent in Latin, you're, of course, just skimming right over that and understanding it all. But for the rest of us, consequently, to get rid of the report, Nero fastened the guilt and inflicted the most exquisite tortures on a class hated for their abominations. Now, the reason that the Tacitus commentary is so useful is because, of course, he didn't like the Christians. So it's nice to have someone who wrote down something. Christians named for Christus, from whom the name had its origin, suffered the extreme penalty during the reign of Tiberius at the hands of one of our procurators, Pontius Pilate, and a most mischievous superstition thus checked for the moment. In other words, Christianity was a mischievous superstition. A lot of people I know still think that. And broke out again in Judea, the first source of the evil, but even in Rome, where all things hideous and shameful from every part of the world find their center and become popular. So this is his point of view. This is some hideous, shameful thing that was imported from Israel. Accordingly, an arrest was first made of all who pleaded guilty. Then, upon their information, an immense multitude was convicted, not so much of the crime of firing the city as hatred against mankind. The book Vitas is one of the great works of Raoul Milor, who taught at UCLA for years. View it as important because it tells us 3 things. Number 1, that there was a sizable number of Christians in Rome in, say, 64, 65. Hundreds. It could be sizable, 800, 900, whatever. Number 2, that they knew that it was connected to Jesus of Jerusalem. They knew that. And that at the time non-Christians made a connection between Christianity in Rome and its origin in Judea. So that's Tacitus's Annals. The other historian who helps us is this man, Titus Flavius Josephus, and you may know Josephus if you've read any Jewish history. He wrote a history of Israel, the Jewish wars, and in that he refers to the Christians. So you get another source from Josephus, his book called The Antiquities of the Jews. First century points of view from someone who lived in Jerusalem, knew a lot about the Christians and about the Jews. And then a third person, Pliny the Younger, who was a very high-level Roman aristocrat who got a job as governor of Bithynia, which would have been the northern part of Turkey in those days, and a very important province. And he wrote home to his emperor, Trajan, and asked him, what exactly should we do with these Christians? Here's the letter. Opens the letter with questions to Trajan concerning trials of Christians that were being brought before him. Since he says he's never been present at any trials of Christians before, this may indicate that previous trials had taken place, but he just hadn't seen it. Should any distinction be made by the age of the Christian? Should the very young be treated differently from mature people? Does denying being a Christian mean the accused is pardoned? So if you speak right up and say, oh, no, I'm not Christian, I never was, Is that enough? Is that it? Is the name of Christianity itself enough to condemn the accused, or is it the crimes associated with being a Christian? So do you have to have done something? When the practice of the sect was banned, indictment of the name, the membership of the group sufficed to secure conviction. But it's just helpful to have yet another source tell us something about this first century.